America had outlawed alcohol. The nation was dry. The government had promised a moral reset. But Chicago didn't stop drinking. It simply moved the entire city behind a door. And once that happened, there was no going back. To understand what Prohibition did to Chicago, we have to understand the world that existed right before it. The world America thought it was fixing. Because Prohibition wasn't just a law, it was an experiment, an attempt to control human behavior with paperwork and penalties. And Chicago would become the place where that experiment was tested at full scale, under full pressure, with millions of people and billions of dollars at stake. The early 20th century was not a simple time of gangsters and jazz, the way pop culture often portrays it. It was an era of massive migration, industrial acceleration, and social upheaval. Chicago was one of the most important cities in the world, precisely because it was a machine, a rail hub, a factory hub, a slaughterhouse hub, a meeting point where America's raw materials were turned into modern life. The Union stockyards processed staggering quantities of meat. Steel plants worked the shoreline and river corridors. Rail yards stitched the city to the nation. Smoke rose daily. Workers poured into the streets by the tens of thousands. The city ran on labor, movement, and momentum. And the people running that machine didn't all share the same culture. Chicago was built by immigrant neighborhoods: Polish, Italian, Irish, Jewish, Lithuanian, Greek, and many more. Languages shifted block by block. Churches and community halls anchored entire districts. Food, music, and daily habits carried across the Atlantic into American streets. Then the Great Migration began reshaping the city from the South. Black Americans, escaping Jim Crow violence and searching for industrial wages, moved north in huge numbers. Chicago's South Side became one of the most important cultural centers in America, not because life was easy there, but because life was concentrated there. Talent, ambition, and survival collided in dense neighborhoods where new identities formed. This was Chicago, crowded, noisy, layered, unequal, alive. And through all of it, alcohol had always been normal. It was in taverns after work, in family gatherings, in social clubs, in restaurants downtown, in back rooms and in celebration, in the rhythm of stress and relief that makes a city bearable. So when the United States banned it in 1920, the country didn't just remove a product, it tried to remove a habit that had been woven into daily life for generations. That was the height from which the city would fall, because when the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act arrived, they didn't land on a blank slate. They landed on a city already running at maximum speed, a city where millions of people were working hard, living close, and seeking escape in whatever forms they could find. And once alcohol became illegal, its value changed instantly. Before Prohibition, liquor was a regulated commodity. After Prohibition, it became contraband. And contraband doesn't behave like normal business. It creates scarcity. It creates risk. It creates secrecy. It creates opportunity. And most importantly, it creates a new kind of power. The power of people willing to break the rules when everyone else still pretends the rules are real. The crucial point here is that Prohibition did not eliminate demand. It didn't even seriously weaken it. Instead, Prohibition took a social behavior and turned it into a market, a black market. And Chicago was perfectly positioned to become its capital. To the north was Canada, where alcohol remained legal. To the east were major industrial corridors. To the west were rural areas where hidden production could be buried under barns and fields. And through the city ran rail lines and waterways that could carry almost anything if you had the right timing and the right protection. At first, the underground drinking scene was small and scattered. A private room here, a bottle in a back closet there, a soft drink parlor that wasn't soft at all. But the economics were too powerful to stay small. By the mid-1920s, Chicago had speakeasies everywhere, thousands of them, according to many estimates. Some were tiny, operating quietly behind a store. Others were huge, loud, glamorous, essentially nightclubs operating as illegal businesses with security, entertainment, and steady supply. And here's where the law created its own paradox. Prohibition was supposed to reduce crime and disorder. Instead, it created an industry that required crime and disorder to function. Because if alcohol is illegal, you can't settle disputes in court. You can't file a complaint. You can't call the police for protection without exposing yourself. So the market solves problems the way markets always do, under pressure. It builds its own enforcement. And that enforcement is violence, not constant violence everywhere. Most people went about their lives, but violence as a background system, the way pressure exists in a boiler. That's how organized crime became the new economy. Bootlegging wasn't just a guy with bottles. It was logistics. It was production, import, storage, distribution, territory, payroll, bribes, lawyers, lookouts, vehicles, schedules, codes, routes. It was an entire supply chain. And once it existed, it didn't just provide alcohol. It provided jobs, drivers, guards, accountants, bouncers, messengers, middlemen, musicians, dishwashers, people who weren't gangsters in the movie sense, just people surviving inside the economy that replaced the legal one. And above all of it sat the question every city asked quietly in those years, who controls it? That question is why Chicago became famous. Not because Chicago was the only city with speakeasies, but because Chicago's underground economy became openly contested. Territory mattered because territory was revenue. A neighborhood wasn't just a place people lived, it was a customer base. A route wasn't just a road, it was profit moving through the night. A warehouse wasn't just storage, it was the beating heart of a supply line. So crews fought, sometimes with fists, sometimes with clubs, and increasingly with guns. The machine gun became the symbol of the era, not because everyone used it, but because it represented a new scale of urban violence, industrial violence, designed for speed and control. And the newspapers turned it into spectacle. This is another crucial part of the Prohibition story. Chicago in the 1920s was not only a city of crime, it was a city of media. Headlines sold, stories sold, names became brands, criminals became characters, and one name rose higher than the rest: Al Capone. Capone did not invent Chicago's underworld, and he did not operate alone, but he understood something many before him didn't. Reputation is leverage. If people fear you, they cooperate. If people admire you, they protect you. If people see you as inevitable, they stop resisting. Capone cultivated an image that made him seem less like a street criminal and more like a business leader operating in an unofficial economy. He dressed well. He smiled. He made public gestures. He played the role of provider. And that role worked because the city itself was full of contradictions. Many ordinary Chicagoans didn't love gang violence, but they also didn't love prohibition. They watched respectable professionals drink in secret, while politicians claimed moral victory in public. They watched raids hit small places, while larger operations seemed untouched. They watched the law act like theater, loud, dramatic, selective, and that created a quiet rot in the relationship between citizens and government. When a law is broken by everyone, enforcement becomes arbitrary, and arbitrary enforcement becomes corruption. This is where police, politics, and money fuse into a single system. Chicago's police force was large, but not large enough to control a city with millions of residents and thousands of illegal businesses. And even if it had been large enough, enforcement required something more valuable than manpower. It required integrity. But integrity is expensive when bribes are cheap and profits are endless. Some officers tried to enforce prohibition honestly. Raids did happen. Arrests did happen. Stills were destroyed. Trucks were seized. But prohibition created too many points of contact where money could flow. A patrolman could look away for a price. A detective could lose information. A raid could be delayed. Evidence could disappear. Witnesses could vanish. Court cases could collapse. And political machines, the networks of loyalty and patronage that dominated city governance, didn't disappear during Prohibition. They adapted. They absorbed the underground economy the way a city absorbs a river. It doesn't stop it, it channels it. So the city learned to live with the contradiction. Daytime Chicago looked like a modern industrial metropolis. The Loop buzzed with office workers. Department stores showcased consumer dreams. Automobiles multiplied. Electric signs lit the streets. Radios entered living rooms, binding families to national voices. Streetcars and the elevated L moved people in constant streams. Factories ran in shifts. Children played between buildings. Neighborhood markets sold familiar food from old countries now stitched into American life. And at night, Chicago became a second city layered on top of the first. The hidden doors opened. Passwords were whispered. Basements filled. Jazz rose through floorboards. The night became its own world, with its own rules. And in that world, Prohibition didn't just change what people drank. It changed how the people behaved. Before Prohibition, saloons were often male spaces. After Prohibition, speakeasies became mixed social spaces where women drank openly alongside men, where nightlife became fashionable, where the act of breaking the law was part of the thrill. The Roaring Twenties image, the flapper, the jazz club, the night out that feels like rebellion, wasn't only cultural evolution, it was the atmosphere Prohibition created. Forbidden things attract attention, and once the underground becomes exciting, it grows. But the glamour had a cost. The alcohol was often unsafe. Bootleg liquor could be diluted, contaminated, or made with industrial chemicals. People were poisoned. Some went blind. Some died. The risk was part of the deal, accepted quietly because the alternative was obedience to a law many didn't respect. This is why Prohibition is one of the best examples in American history of the problem-change-consequence loop. The problem: lawmakers believed alcohol caused social decay. The change: they banned alcohol nationwide. The consequence: alcohol became more profitable and more dangerous, feeding organized crime and weakening faith in law. Another loop followed. The problem: the city grew fast from industrial expansion and migration. The change: neighborhoods became overcrowded, segregated, and strained. The consequence: social tension rose, while underground economies found recruits among the people with the least protection. And the final loop: the problem: modernization accelerated consumer culture and loosened old traditions. The change: nightlife, entertainment, and media reshaped identity. The consequence: older generations felt society was collapsing, deepening the cultural divide between urban America and rural America. Chicago wasn't just wild. It was the laboratory where modern American urban life emerged with all its energy and instability. And then, almost without warning, the decade turned. By the early 1930s, America was no longer in a mood for moral experiment. The Great Depression shattered the illusion of endless growth. Jobs vanished. Savings disappeared. Hunger replaced glamour. And suddenly, the nation looked at Prohibition and saw not virtue, but waste. Tax revenue from legal alcohol suddenly seemed attractive. Enforcement costs seemed absurd. Crime seemed worse than the original problem. And public opinion shifted. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition. The country re-legalized alcohol. Breweries reopened. Bars went public again. The hidden doors didn't need to be hidden anymore. But here is the quiet truth that makes the whole era feel almost surreal. For many Chicagoans, repeal didn't change daily drinking, because drinking had never stopped. What ended wasn't alcohol. What ended was the pretense. The secrecy dissolved. The underground economy lost its most profitable fuel. Some criminal networks weakened. Others shifted to different rackets. The city moved forward, carrying scars and stories into the modern age. And if you walk through Chicago today, the echoes are still everywhere. The L still loops downtown. Brick buildings from that era still stand. Neighborhood identities formed by migration still shape the city's culture. Jazz remains part of its DNA. The reputation, bold, intense, slightly dangerous, still clings to the skyline. But the stockyards are gone. The smoke is lighter. The speakeasy is no longer survival. It's nostalgia. Yet the lesson of Prohibition remains disturbingly modern. You cannot legislate away human desire. You can only redirect it. And when you redirect it into secrecy, you create a market where violence becomes regulation, where corruption becomes normal, and where entire cities learn to live in two realities at once, the official one and the real one. Imagine standing on a Chicago street corner in 1926. You would hear jazz bleeding through basement doors. You would smell coal smoke and city pavement after rain. You would see men hurrying home from factories, women stepping confidently into nightlife, police watching with unreadable faces, cars moving too fast through intersections. You would feel ambition everywhere. Not the clean ambition of textbooks, but the messy ambition of people trying to survive, to rise, to escape, to win. Chicago in the Prohibition era was not a story about alcohol. It was a story about a modern city discovering its true nature. Complex, adaptable, lawless in the quiet places, structured in the loud ones, and always moving.